Lucas stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, his silhouette stark against the darkening Chicago skyline. The air felt heavy, charged with the promise of an impending storm. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the luxury that surrounded him, a far cry from the poverty he'd known as a child. His eyes swept over the city below, a patchwork of lights and shadows. In the distance, he could make out the outline of his old neighborhood, a place he'd sworn never to return to. The memories of those early years came unbidden, a stark contrast to his current reality. Lucas remembered the cramped apartment, the constant worry about money, and the gnawing hunger that had been his constant companion. He recalled the shame of wearing second-hand clothes and the taunts of his classmates. Those experiences had fueled his relentless drive for success, pushing him to amass the fortune that now defined his life. As another flash of lightning lit up the sky, Lucas's thoughts turned to his latest project. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before he began to type a message to Tiana. Tiana was a promising student he'd met at a university fundraiser. She was sharp, ambitious, and most importantly, naive. Lucas saw in her the perfect combination of intelligence and vulnerability that he could exploit for his own ends. "Tiana," he typed, "I have a unique opportunity for you. There's an abandoned building I'd like to explore, and I think you'd find it fascinating. It's a chance to see a side of Chicago few ever experience. Are you interested?" He hit send, knowing that the lure of exclusivity and adventure would be hard for her to resist. Lucas smiled to himself, imagining her reaction. He knew how to play people, how to dangle just the right bait to reel them in. As he waited for her response, Lucas poured himself a glass of expensive scotch. He savored the burn as he swallowed, his mind already racing with plans. The abandoned building was more than just a decaying structure. It was the key to expanding his underground empire, and Tiana, whether she knew it or not, was about to become an integral part of that expansion. Across town, in a small, cluttered dorm room, Tiana's phone buzzed with Lucas's message. She was hunched over her desk, surrounded by textbooks and half-empty coffee cups, the detritus of a long night of studying. The sudden interruption startled her, breaking her concentration. Tiana picked up her phone, her eyebrows rising as she read Lucas's invitation. She leaned back in her chair, chewing her lower lip as she considered his offer. The rational part of her brain warned her to be cautious. After all, she barely knew Lucas, and exploring an abandoned building seemed risky at best. But another part of her, the part that craved excitement and a break from the monotony of her academic life, was intrigued. She thought about the pile of assignments waiting for her, the upcoming exams, and the constant pressure to excel. The idea of escaping all that, even for a little while, was tempting. Tiana's finger hovered over the reply button as she wrestled with her decision. She thought about Lucas, his charm, his success, the way he seemed to move through life with effortless confidence. Being around him made her feel important, as if she was part of something bigger than her everyday struggles. Still, there was something that nagged at her, a vague sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't anything concrete, just a feeling in the pit of her stomach that warned her to be careful. Tiana had always prided herself on her intuition, and right now, it was sending mixed signals. She stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the campus grounds below. Students hurried along the paths, their heads down against the wind that had picked up, heralding the approaching storm. Tiana felt suddenly isolated, cut off from the normal flow of college life. Making up her mind, she turned back to her phone and began to type a response to Lucas. "I'm in," she wrote, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "When and where should we meet?" As she hit send, a crack of thunder shook the window, making her jump. Tiana laughed nervously at her own reaction, trying to shake off the feeling that she had just set something significant in motion. Back in his penthouse, Lucas felt his phone vibrate. He read Tiana's response with a satisfied smirk. Everything was falling into place. He quickly sent her the details for their meeting, then turned his attention back to the storm outside. The rain had started, pelting against the windows in sheets. Lucas watched the water cascade down the glass, distorting his view of the city. In that moment, he felt invincible, a master puppeteer pulling the strings of those around him. Little did he know that across the city, another player was about to enter the game. Mrs. Baker, a longtime resident of the neighborhood where the abandoned building stood, had noticed the increased activity around the structure. Her keen eyes had picked up on the comings and goings of people who didn't belong, and her instincts told her something wasn't right. As the storm raged outside, 3 lives were about to intersect in ways none of them could have predicted. Lucas, driven by greed and ambition, Tiana, searching for excitement and meaning, and Mrs. Baker, determined to protect her community at all costs. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose long-buried secrets, challenge loyalties, and ultimately change the course of their lives forever. As the night deepened and the storm intensified, each of them prepared in their own way for what was to come, unaware of the forces they were about to unleash. The next evening, Tiana stood at the corner of a dimly lit street, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of Lucas. The abandoned building loomed before her, a hulking mass of crumbling brick and shattered windows. Graffiti covered its walls, a chaotic mix of tags and murals that seemed to writhe in the flickering streetlight. Tiana pulled her jacket tighter around herself, suppressing a shiver that had little to do with the cool night air. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, save for the distant wail of a siren and the occasional rumble of a passing car. She checked her phone again, confirming she was in the right place at the right time. Suddenly, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The tinted window rolled down, revealing Lucas's familiar face. "Hop in," he said, his smile both charming and slightly predatory. Tiana hesitated for a moment, her earlier misgivings resurfacing. But Lucas's confident demeanor and the promise of adventure won out. She slid into the passenger seat, the car's leather interior a stark contrast to the decaying neighborhood outside. As Lucas maneuvered the car into a hidden alleyway, Tiana took in his appearance. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. His cologne, subtle yet expensive, filled the car's interior. "I'm glad you decided to come," Lucas said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Not many people have the courage to step out of their comfort zone like this. Tiana nodded, unsure of how to respond. As they exited the car and approached the building, she couldn't help but notice how at ease Lucas seemed in these surroundings. It was as if he belonged here, among the shadows and decay. They entered through a rusted side door that Lucas easily forced open. The interior was dark, musty, and filled with debris. Lucas produced a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom to reveal peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. "Watch your step," Lucas warned, guiding Tiana over a fallen beam. "This place has seen better days, but it has a certain charm, don't you think?" As they made their way deeper into the building, Lucas began to share stories of his life. He spoke of growing up poor, of the determination that drove him to succeed, and of the thrill he still got from taking risks. "You see, Tiana," he said, his voice echoing in the empty hallway, "life is all about seizing opportunities. Sometimes those opportunities aren't exactly conventional." Tiana listened, fascinated despite herself. Lucas's words painted a picture of a world she'd only dreamed of, a world where anything was possible if you were willing to bend the rules. They climbed a creaking staircase to the upper floors, where the signs of recent activity became more apparent. Fresh footprints in the dust, discarded food wrappers, and the occasional glint of something metallic hidden in the shadows. "What exactly do you do here, Lucas?" Tiana asked, her curiosity finally overcoming her caution. Lucas's smile widened. "Let's just say I facilitate certain transactions. Nothing illegal, of course, just alternative business practices." As they continued their exploration, neither of them noticed the figure watching from across the street. Mrs. Baker stood in the shadow of a derelict storefront. Her eyes narrowed as she observed Lucas and Tiana enter the building. Mrs. Baker had lived in this neighborhood for over 5 decades. She'd seen it change from a thriving community to a forgotten corner of the city, plagued by crime and neglect. But in recent years, she'd noticed a new kind of danger creeping in, one that wore expensive suits and drove luxury cars. She'd been watching the abandoned building for weeks now, noting the strange comings and goings. Young people like Tiana would arrive, looking nervous and excited. They'd leave hours later, often with haunted expressions and pockets full of cash. Mrs. Baker's weathered hand tightened around her cell phone. She'd called the police multiple times, but they always arrived too late, finding nothing but empty rooms and lingering shadows. She knew she had to do something more, but at her age, confronting criminals directly wasn't an option. As she debated her next move, Mrs. Baker thought about all the young lives she'd seen ruined by false promises and easy money. She thought about her own grandchildren, how easily they could be lured into something dangerous by someone like Lucas. Inside the building, Tiana was becoming increasingly uneasy. The initial thrill of exploration had worn off, replaced by a growing sense that she was out of her depth. Lucas's stories, once exciting, now seemed to have a sinister undertone. They reached a room on the top floor that was surprisingly well maintained compared to the rest of the building. Lucas flipped a switch, and bare bulbs flickered to life, revealing a space that looked like a makeshift office. "This is where the magic happens," Lucas said, gesturing around the room. "From here we can make dreams come true, for the right price, of course." Tiana's eyes widened as she took in the scene. Computers hummed on battered desks, their screens displaying complex financial data. In one corner, a safe stood open, filled with stacks of cash and what looked like gold bars. "Lucas," Tiana said, her voice trembling slightly, "what's really going on here?" Before Lucas could answer, a noise from outside caught their attention. Mrs. Baker, in her determination to gather evidence, had accidentally knocked over a trash can while trying to get a better view of the building's entrance. Lucas's demeanor changed instantly. The charming smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Looks like we have some uninvited guests," he muttered, moving quickly to the window. Tiana felt a chill run down her spine. The Lucas she thought she knew was gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous. She watched as he pulled out a phone and rapidly typed out a message. "I think it's time we wrapped up our little tour," Lucas said, turning back to Tiana with a forced smile. "There's just one more thing I need to show you." As Lucas led Tiana towards another room, Mrs. Baker outside was frantically dialing 911. She'd seen enough to know that the situation was escalating, and she feared for the young woman she'd seen enter the building. "Police emergency, what's your situation?" The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. "There's suspicious activity at the old Parkview building on 47th Street, Mrs. Baker said, her voice low but urgent. "I've seen people going in and out at all hours. I think there's a young woman in danger right now." As she spoke, Mrs. Baker saw more cars pulling up to the building. Men in dark clothing emerged, their movements purposeful and menacing. She realized with a sinking heart that even if the police responded immediately, they might be too late. Inside, Tiana was beginning to panic. The excitement of the evening had turned into a nightmare, and she was desperate to find a way out. But Lucas's grip on her arm was firm as he guided her through the labyrinthine corridors of the old building. "You know, Tiana," Lucas said, his voice eerily calm, "I had high hopes for you. I thought you might be someone who could appreciate the opportunities I'm offering. But now, I'm not so sure." Tiana's mind raced, searching for a way to diffuse the situation. "I do appreciate it, Lucas," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is all just a lot to take in. Maybe if we could talk about it somewhere else?" Lucas chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, we're well past that point now, my dear. You've seen too much to simply walk away. But don't worry, I have a proposition for you. One that I think you'll find very difficult to refuse." As they reached a heavy metal door at the end of a hallway, Tiana knew she had to make a decision. She could go along with whatever Lucas had planned, hoping to find a way out later, or she could make a stand now, risking everything. Outside, Mrs. Baker watched in dismay as more people entered the building. She felt helpless, knowing that the young woman inside was in grave danger but unable to do anything directly to help her. As the sound of distant sirens began to fill the air, Mrs. Baker made a decision. She may be old, but she wasn't powerless. With a determination born of years of fighting for her community, she began to move towards the building. She didn't know what she could do, but she knew she had to try something. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change all their lives forever. Lucas, confident in his power and control. Tiana, trapped but not defeated. And Mrs. Baker, an unlikely hero stepping into the fray. As the night deepened, the abandoned building became the focal point of a drama that would expose the dark underbelly of the city and test the limits of courage, loyalty, and survival. Lucas pushed open the heavy metal door, revealing a room that stood in stark contrast to the decaying building around them. The space was well lit, climate-controlled, and filled with rows of shelves and locked cabinets. It looked like a cross between a high-end storage facility and a museum's back room. "Welcome to my little treasure trove," Lucas said, his voice tinged with pride. He gestured around the room with a sweeping motion. "This, Tiana, is where the real magic happens." Tiana's eyes widened as she took in the scene before her. The shelves were laden with an eclectic mix of items: antique jewelry, rare books, paintings still in their frames, and even what appeared to be ancient artifacts. In one corner, a state-of-the-art computer setup hummed quietly. "What is all this?" Tiana asked, unable to keep the awe out of her voice despite her growing fear. Lucas smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "This is my business, Tiana, or rather one facet of it. You see, there are people in this world who want things, rare things, valuable things, things they're not supposed to have, and I make it possible for them to get those things." He walked over to one of the shelves and picked up a small statuette, turning it over in his hands. "This little beauty, for instance, it's a pre-Columbian figurine, over 2,000 years old. Technically, it belongs in a museum in Peru, but soon it'll be gracing the private collection of a businessman in Tokyo." Tiana felt her heart race as the implications of what Lucas was saying sank in. You're stealing these things?" Lucas chuckled, setting the statuette back on the shelf. "Stealing is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as redistribution. These items were just gathering dust in museums or private collections. Now they're making people happy and, more importantly, making me very, very rich." He turned to face Tiana, his expression suddenly serious. "And this is where you come in, my dear. You see, I'm always looking for bright, ambitious young people to join my organization. People who aren't afraid to think outside the box, who want more out of life than a 9-to-5 job and a mediocre paycheck." Tiana took a step back, her mind reeling. I don't know what to say, Lucas. This is all so overwhelming." "I understand," Lucas said, his tone softening. "But think about it, Tiana. With your intelligence and my connections, we could do amazing things together. You could have wealth beyond your wildest dreams, travel the world, never worry about student loans or job security again." As Lucas continued his sales pitch, Tiana's thoughts were in turmoil. Part of her was terrified, knowing that she was in way over her head. But another part, a part she wasn't proud of, was tempted by Lucas's offer. The idea of escaping her mundane life, of having the kind of wealth and power Lucas was describing, was seductive. Outside the building, Mrs. Baker had made her way closer, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She could hear voices now, muffled but distinct, coming from an upper floor. The police sirens were getting louder, but she knew they might not arrive in time. With a deep breath, Mrs. Baker steeled herself and entered the building. The interior was dark and foreboding, but she pressed on, guided by the sound of voices and her own unwavering resolve. Back in the secret room, Lucas was showing Tiana more of his ill-gotten treasures. "This painting," he said, gesturing to a canvas leaning against the wall, "is a lost masterpiece by a renowned artist. It was thought to have been destroyed during World War II. Can you imagine the price it'll fetch at a private auction?" Tiana nodded numbly, her mind still struggling to process everything she was seeing and hearing. She watched as Lucas moved around the room, proudly displaying his stolen goods like a museum curator. As Lucas reached for another item, Tiana noticed something that made her blood run cold. Partially hidden behind a stack of crates was what looked like a weapons case. The lid was slightly open, revealing the gleam of metal inside. Lucas, following her gaze, quickly moved to close the case. "Ah, yes. Sometimes our clients require additional services. Protection, let's say. It's just business, Tiana. Nothing personal." The casual way he spoke about weapons, as if they were just another commodity to be bought and sold, finally shook Tiana out of her daze. She realized with crystal clarity that she needed to get out of this situation, and fast. "Lucas," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "this is all very impressive, but I don't think I'm cut out for this kind of business. Maybe I should go home and think about it." Lucas's expression hardened, the charming facade slipping away. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Tiana. You've seen too much. You're either with us now, or you're a liability." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Tiana felt fear grip her heart as she realized the true danger she was in. She glanced around the room, looking for a way out, but Lucas was between her and the only door. Just as the tension in the room reached a breaking point, there was a commotion outside. Shouts and the sound of running feet echoed through the building. Lucas cursed under his breath, reaching for his phone. "Looks like we have company. Change of plans, Tiana. You're coming with me." As Lucas grabbed Tiana's arm, preparing to drag her out of the room, the door burst open. To everyone's surprise, it wasn't the police who entered, but Mrs. Baker, her face set in a determined scowl. "Let that girl go, you scoundrel!" Mrs. Baker shouted, brandishing her cell phone like a weapon. "I've called the police and they're on their way. It's over!" Lucas, momentarily stunned by the appearance of this unexpected intruder, loosened his grip on Tiana. It was all the opening she needed. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Tiana wrenched her arm free and darted towards Mrs. Baker. "You meddling old fool," Lucas snarled, reaching into his jacket. But before he could pull out whatever weapon he had concealed there, Tiana grabbed a heavy statuette from a nearby shelf and hurled it at him. The statuette caught Lucas in the shoulder, throwing off his aim. His gun clattered to the floor, sliding across the room. "Run!" Tiana shouted, grabbing Mrs. Baker's hand and pulling her towards the door. As they fled down the corridor, they could hear Lucas shouting orders to his men. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them, growing closer with each passing second. Mrs. Baker, despite her age, kept pace with Tiana as they navigated the maze-like interior of the abandoned building. "I knew there was something fishy going on here," she panted as they ran. "Been watching this place for weeks." Tiana felt a surge of gratitude towards this brave woman who had put herself in danger to help a stranger. "Thank you," she gasped. "But we're not out of this yet." They reached a stairwell and began to descend, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. Just as they reached the ground floor, they heard the unmistakable wail of police sirens outside. "This way," Mrs. Baker said, guiding Tiana towards a side exit she had noticed earlier. "We can slip out while they're distracted by the police." As they emerged into the cool night air, Tiana saw police cars converging on the building's main entrance. Officers with guns drawn were ordering Lucas's men to surrender. In the chaos, Tiana and Mrs. Baker managed to slip away unnoticed. They didn't stop running until they were several blocks away, finally pausing in the doorway of a closed shop to catch their breath. "Are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Baker asked, her concern evident despite her own exhaustion. Tiana nodded, still trying to process everything that had happened. "I can't believe... how did you—" Mrs. Baker patted Tiana's hand reassuringly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for a long time, child. I've seen all sorts of trouble come and go. When I saw you go into that building with that smooth-talking fellow, I knew something wasn't right." As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full impact of the evening's events hit Tiana. She slumped against the wall, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was so stupid," she whispered. "I almost got caught up in something terrible." Now, Mrs. Baker said, her voice gentle but firm. "You made a mistake, but you also made the right choice when it counted. That takes courage." As they stood there, the sound of sirens still echoing in the distance, Tiana realized that her life had changed irrevocably. She had glimpsed a world she never knew existed, faced real danger, and come out the other side. "What happens now?" she asked, looking at Mrs. Baker. The older woman smiled, a hint of steel in her eyes. "Now, my dear, we make sure justice is served. We tell the police everything we saw. And then we work to make sure nothing like this ever happens in our community again." Tiana nodded, feeling a new sense of purpose. She had entered that abandoned building as a naive student seeking adventure. She was leaving it as someone determined to make a difference. As they made their way to the police station to give their statements, Tiana knew that this was just the beginning. Lucas and his criminal empire might have been exposed, but there was still much work to be done to heal the wounds inflicted on the community. With Mrs. Baker by her side, Tiana felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The night's harrowing adventure had shown her the darkness that existed in the world, but it had also shown her the power of courage, community, and doing what was right. Lucas pushed open the heavy metal door, revealing a room that stood in stark contrast to the decaying building around them. The space was well lit, climate-controlled, and filled with rows of shelves and locked cabinets. It looked like a cross between a high-end storage facility and a museum's back room. "Welcome to my little treasure trove," Lucas said, his voice tinged with pride. He gestured around the room with a sweeping motion. "This, Tiana, is where the real magic happens." Tiana's eyes widened as she took in the scene before her. The shelves were laden with an eclectic mix of items: antique jewelry, rare books, paintings still in their frames, and even what appeared to be ancient artifacts. In one corner, a state-of-the-art computer setup hummed quietly. "What is all this?" Tiana asked, unable to keep the awe out of her voice despite her growing fear. Lucas smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "This is my business, Tiana, or rather one facet of it. You see, there are people in this world who want things. Rare things, valuable things, things they're not supposed to have. And I make it possible for them to get those things." He walked over to one of the shelves and picked up a small statuette, turning it over in his hands. "This little beauty, for instance. It's a pre-Columbian figurine, over 2,000 years old. Technically, it belongs in a museum in Peru, but soon it'll be gracing the private collection of a businessman in Tokyo." Tiana felt her heart race as the implications of what Lucas was saying sank in. You're stealing these things?" Lucas chuckled, setting the statuette back on the shelf. "Stealing is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as redistribution. These items were just gathering dust in museums or private collections. Now they're making people happy, and more importantly, making me very, very rich." He turned to face Tiana, his expression suddenly serious. "And this is where you come in, my dear. You see, I'm always looking for bright, ambitious young people to join my organization. People who aren't afraid to think outside the box, who want more out of life than a 9-to-5 job and a mediocre paycheck." Tiana took a step back, her mind reeling. I don't know what to say, Lucas. This is all so overwhelming, I understand," Lucas said, his tone softening. "But think about it, Tiana. With your intelligence and my connections, We could do amazing things together. You could have wealth beyond your wildest dreams, travel the world, never worry about student loans or job security again." As Lucas continued his sales pitch, Tiana's thoughts were in turmoil. Part of her was terrified, knowing that she was in way over her head. But another part, a part she wasn't proud of, was tempted by Lucas's offer. The idea of escaping her mundane life, of having the kind of wealth and power Lucas was describing, was seductive. Outside the building, Mrs. Baker had made her way closer, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She could hear voices now, muffled but distinct, coming from an upper floor. The police sirens were getting louder, but she knew they might not arrive in time. With a deep breath, Mrs. Baker steeled herself and entered the building. The interior was dark and foreboding, but she pressed on, guided by the sound of voices and her own unwavering resolve. Back in the secret room, Lucas was showing Tiana more of his ill-gotten treasures. "This painting," he said, gesturing to a canvas leaning against the wall, "is a lost masterpiece by a renowned artist. It was thought to have been destroyed during World War II. Can you imagine the price it'll fetch at a private auction?" Tiana nodded numbly, her mind still struggling to process everything she was seeing and hearing. She watched as Lucas moved around the room, proudly displaying his stolen goods like a museum curator. As Lucas reached for another item, Tiana noticed something that made her blood run cold. Partially hidden behind a stack of crates was what looked like a weapons case. The lid was slightly open, revealing the gleam of metal inside. Lucas, following her gaze, quickly moved to close the case. "Ah, yes, sometimes our clients require additional services. Protection, let's say. It's just business, Tiana, nothing personal." The casual way he spoke about weapons as if they were just another commodity to be bought and sold finally shook Tiana out of her daze. She realized with crystal clarity that she needed to get out of this situation, and fast. "Lucas," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "this is all very impressive, but I don't think I'm cut out for this kind of business. Maybe I should go home and think about it." Lucas's expression hardened, the charming facade slipping away. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Tiana. You've seen too much. You're either with us now, or you're a liability." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Tiana felt fear grip her heart as she realized the true danger she was in. She glanced around the room, looking for a way out, but Lucas was between her and the only door. Just as the tension in the room reached a breaking point, there was a commotion outside. Shouts and the sound of running feet echoed through the building. Lucas cursed under his breath, reaching for his phone. "Looks like we have company. Change of plans, Tiana. You're coming with me." As Lucas grabbed Tiana's arm, preparing to drag her out of the room, the door burst open. To everyone's surprise, it wasn't the police who entered, but Mrs. Baker, her face set in a determined scowl. "Let that girl go, you scoundrel!" Mrs. Baker shouted, brandishing her cell phone like a weapon. "I've called the police and they're on their way. It's over!" Lucas, momentarily stunned by the appearance of this unexpected intruder, loosened his grip on Tiana. It was all the opening she needed. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Tiana wrenched her arm free and darted towards Mrs. Baker. "You meddling old fool," Lucas snarled, reaching into his jacket. But before he could pull out whatever weapon he had concealed there, Tiana grabbed a heavy statuette from a nearby shelf and hurled it at him. The statuette caught Lucas in the shoulder, throwing off his aim. His gun clattered to the floor, sliding across the room. "Run!" Tiana shouted, grabbing Mrs. Baker's hand and pulling her towards the door. As they fled down the corridor, they could hear Lucas shouting orders to his men. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them, growing closer with each passing second. Mrs. Baker, despite her age, kept pace with Tiana as they navigated the maze-like interior of the abandoned building. "I knew there was something fishy going on here," she panted as they ran. "Been watching this place for weeks." Tiana felt a surge of gratitude towards this brave woman who had put herself in danger to help a stranger. "Thank you," she gasped. "But we're not out of this yet." They reached a stairwell and began to descend, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. Just as they reached the ground floor, they heard the unmistakable wail of police sirens outside. "This way," Mrs. Baker said, guiding Tiana towards a side exit she had noticed earlier. "We can slip out while they're distracted by the police." As they emerged into the cool night air, Tiana saw police cars converging on the building's main entrance. Officers with guns drawn were ordering Lucas's men to surrender. In the chaos, Tiana and Mrs. Baker managed to slip away unnoticed. They didn't stop running until they were several blocks away, finally pausing in the doorway of a closed shop to catch their breath. "Are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Baker asked, her concern evident despite her own exhaustion. Tiana nodded, still trying to process everything that had happened. How did you—" "Mrs. Baker patted Tiana's hand reassuringly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for a long time, child. I've seen all sorts of trouble come and go. When I saw you go into that building with that smooth-talking fellow, I knew something wasn't right." As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full impact of the evening's events hit Tiana. She slumped against the wall, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was so stupid," she whispered. "I almost got caught up in something terrible." Now, Mrs. Baker said, her voice gentle but firm. "You made a mistake, but you also made the right choice when it counted. That takes courage." As they stood there, the sound of sirens still echoing in the distance, Tiana realized that her life had changed irrevocably. She had glimpsed a world she never knew existed, faced real danger, and come out the other side. "What happens now?" she asked, looking at Mrs. Baker. The older woman smiled, a hint of steel in her eyes. "Now, my dear, we make sure justice is served. We tell the police everything we saw, and then we work to make sure nothing like this ever happens in our community again." Tiana nodded, feeling a new sense of purpose. She had entered that abandoned building as a naive student seeking adventure. She was leaving it as someone determined to make a difference. As they made their way to the police station to give their statements, Tiana knew that this was just the beginning. Lucas and his criminal empire might have been exposed, but there was still much work to be done to heal the wounds inflicted on the community. With Mrs. Baker by her side, Tiana felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The night's harrowing adventure had shown her the darkness that existed in the world, but it had also shown her the power of courage, community, and doing what was right. In the days following the incident at the abandoned building, Tiana found herself struggling to readjust to her normal routine. The world of classes, assignments, and campus life seemed surreal after her brush with Lucas's criminal underworld. She found it hard to concentrate, her mind constantly replaying the events of that night. One afternoon, as Tiana sat in the university library attempting to study, her phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Baker. "Meeting at the community center tonight at 7. Would love for you to join us. Time to start making a difference." Tiana stared at the message, a mix of excitement and anxiety bubbling up inside her. She hadn't seen Mrs. Baker since their breakfast after the police interview. Part of her was eager to get involved, to do something positive with her experience. Another part was terrified of facing the reality of what had happened. After a moment's hesitation, she typed out a reply. "I'll be there." That evening, Tiana found herself standing outside a modest building with a sign that read, "Parkside Community Center." She took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, she found a diverse group of people gathered in a large room. There were teenagers, elderly residents, and everything in between. Mrs. Baker spotted her immediately and waved her over. "I'm so glad you came, dear," Mrs. Baker said, drawing Tiana into a warm hug. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Tiana. She's going to be joining us in our efforts to make our neighborhood safer." As introductions were made, Tiana felt overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance of the group. These people didn't know the details of what had happened with Lucas, but they welcomed her without question. The meeting began. and Tiana listened as community members discussed various issues facing the neighborhood. They talked about abandoned buildings being used for criminal activities, the lack of after-school programs for youth, and the need for better lighting in certain areas. As the discussion progressed, Tiana found herself becoming more engaged. She began to see how her experience with Lucas connected to larger issues in the community. When Mrs. Baker encouraged her to share her thoughts, Tiana surprised herself by speaking up. "I think we need to focus on giving young people alternatives," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I almost got caught up in something dangerous because I was looking for excitement, for a way out of my ordinary life. If we can provide positive outlets for that energy, maybe we can prevent others from making the same mistake." Her words were met with nods of agreement and encouraging smiles. As the meeting continued, Tiana found herself fully invested in the discussions and planning. After the meeting, Mrs. Baker pulled Tiana aside. "You did wonderfully, dear. I knew you had it in you." Tiana smiled, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced before. "Thank you for inviting me. I think this is exactly what I needed." As Tiana left the community center that night, she felt a shift in her perspective. The fear and shame that had been weighing her down began to lift, replaced by a determination to make a difference. Over the next few weeks, Tiana threw herself into community work. She helped organize a cleanup of the area around the abandoned building where her adventure with Lucas had begun. She volunteered at a local youth center, sharing her story as a cautionary tale, and mentoring kids who were at risk of falling into the same traps she nearly had. One afternoon, as Tiana was helping to set up for a community event, Detective Martinez arrived at the center. The detective's presence immediately put Tiana on edge. "Ms. Thompson," Detective Martinez said, her expression serious, "I need to speak with you about the case against Lucas Blackwood." Tiana felt her heart rate increase. "Is everything okay? Did something happen?" Detective Martinez gestured for Tiana to sit down. "Lucas Blackwood is trying to make a deal with the prosecution. He's offered to provide information on his associates and the broader criminal network he was part of." Tiana listened, her mind racing. "What does this mean for the case?" "It means things are going to get complicated," Detective Martinez replied. "Blackwood's lawyers are pushing for a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. But for this deal to work, we need strong testimony from witnesses like yourself to ensure he doesn't get off too lightly." The detective's words hit Tiana like a punch to the gut. The idea of facing Lucas in court, of reliving that night in front of a room full of strangers, was terrifying. I don't know if I can do that," Tiana said, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Martinez leaned forward, her tone softening slightly. "I understand this is difficult, Ms. Thompson, but your testimony could be crucial in ensuring justice is served. Not just for you, but for all the people Blackwood and his associates have hurt over the years." As the detective continued to explain the situation, Tiana felt overwhelmed. She excused herself and stepped outside, needing a moment to clear her head. She found herself walking aimlessly through the neighborhood, her thoughts in turmoil. The streets that had once seemed ordinary now held new meaning. Every abandoned building, every shadowy alley reminded her of that night with Lucas. Without realizing it, Tiana had made her way to Mrs. Baker's house. She hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Mrs. Baker answered, her face lighting up at the sight of Tiana, but her smile quickly faded as she took in Tiana's distressed expression. "Come in, child," Mrs. Baker said, ushering Tiana inside. "Tell me what's troubling you." Over a cup of tea, Tiana poured out her fears and doubts about testifying. Mrs. Baker listened patiently, her weathered hands wrapped around her own mug. When Tiana finished speaking, Mrs. Baker was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tiana, do you remember the night we met? How scared you were in that building?" Tiana nodded, the memory still vivid. "But you didn't let that fear paralyze you," Mrs. Baker continued. "You acted. You helped bring a dangerous man to justice. That same courage is still in you." Mrs. Baker reached out and took Tiana's hand. "I know testifying is scary, but think about all the people you could help, all the young people who might be saved from making the same mistakes." Tiana felt tears welling up in her eyes. "But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I freeze up on the stand?" Mrs. Baker squeezed her hand. "You are stronger than you know, dear. And you won't be alone. I'll be there with you, and so will all the people you've helped in this community. We'll stand behind you." As Mrs. Baker's words sank in, Tiana felt a resolve begin to build within her. She thought about the kids she'd been mentoring, about the community that had embraced her. She thought about Lucas and the damage he'd done. Taking a deep breath, Tiana straightened her shoulders. "You're right," she said. "I need to do this, not just for me, but for everyone." Mrs. Baker smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "That's my girl. Now let's call that detective and tell her you're ready to testify." As Tiana dialed Detective Martinez's number, she felt a mix of fear and determination. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew she had the strength to face it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Tiana worked with the prosecutors, going over her testimony again and again. She learned about court procedures and what to expect during cross-examination. Throughout it all, the community rallied around her. Mrs. Baker was a constant presence, offering support and encouragement. The young people Tiana had been mentoring organized a support group, promising to attend the trial to show their solidarity. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. As Tiana walked up the courthouse steps, she felt a momentary wave of panic. But then she saw Mrs. Baker waiting for her, along with a group of community members. Their presence gave her strength. Inside the courtroom, Tiana took her seat at the witness stand. As she was sworn in, she caught sight of Lucas for the first time since that night. He looked smaller somehow, less intimidating in his prison jumpsuit. As the questioning began, Tiana focused on telling her story clearly and honestly. She described how Lucas had lured her to the abandoned building, how he had revealed his criminal enterprise, and how she had realized the danger she was in. During cross-examination, Lucas's lawyer tried to paint Tiana as a willing participant, someone who had known what she was getting into. But Tiana stood her ground, her voice growing stronger as she refuted each accusation. When it was over, Tiana felt drained, but proud. She had faced her fears and told the truth. As she left the witness stand, she saw Mrs. Baker in the audience, nodding approvingly with tears in her eyes. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by her supporters, Tiana felt a sense of closure. Whatever the outcome of the trial, she knew she had done the right thing. She had turned a frightening experience into an opportunity for growth and positive change. As the group walked away from the courthouse, Mrs. Baker linked her arm with Tiana's. "You did it, dear," she said softly. "You stood up for what's right. Now, what do you say we go back to the community center? There's still work to be done." Tiana nodded, a smile spreading across her face. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing she had the strength within her and a community behind her. The abandoned building that had once been a symbol of fear now stood as a reminder of her resilience and the power of community. As they walked, Tiana began to plan their next project, her mind already turning towards the future and the positive changes they could make together. The weeks following the trial were a blur of activity for Tiana. The community center had become her second home, a place where she poured her energy into making positive changes. Today, she stood before a group of teenagers, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "I know what you're thinking," Tiana began, her voice steady. "You're wondering why you should listen to me. Well, not too long ago, I was sitting where you are, thinking I had it all figured out." She proceeded to tell her story, not sparing the details of how close she'd come to being pulled into Lucas's criminal world. The room was silent as she spoke. the teenagers hanging on her every word. "The point is," Tiana concluded, "there are people out there who will try to lure you with promises of easy money and excitement. But trust me, the cost is far higher than you can imagine." As the session ended and the teens filed out, one girl lingered behind. She approached Tiana hesitantly. "Miss Thompson, I think I might be in a situation like yours." Tiana felt her heart race, but she kept her expression calm. "Do you want to talk about it?" The girl who introduced herself as Zoe nodded. Over the next hour, she confided in Tiana about an older boy who'd been promising her a glamorous lifestyle, hinting at business opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Tiana listened, offering gentle guidance and support. By the end of their conversation, Zoe had agreed to bring her parents to the community center to discuss the situation further. As Zoe left, Mrs. Baker, who had been watching from the doorway, entered the room. "You handled that beautifully, dear," she said, pride evident in her voice. Tiana smiled, feeling a mix of relief and concern. "I just hope we caught it in time. If Zoe had gotten in any deeper—" Mrs. Baker patted her arm reassuringly. "That's why what we're doing here is so important. You're making a real difference, Tiana." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Martinez. The detective's presence at the community center had become a regular occurrence as she worked with them on various neighborhood safety initiatives. "Ladies," Detective Martinez greeted them, her expression serious. "We need to talk. There's been a development in the Blackwood case." Tiana felt a knot form in her stomach. "What kind of development?" Detective Martinez sighed. "Lucas Blackwood has agreed to testify against his higher-ups. In exchange, he's being moved to a minimum security facility." The news hit Tiana like a physical blow. "Minimum security? After everything he did?" "I know it's not ideal," Detective Martinez said, her frustration evident. "But the information he's providing could help us take down an entire network of criminals. It's a trade-off the DA felt was necessary." Tiana turned away, trying to process this information. She felt Mrs. Baker's hand on her shoulder, a comforting presence. "What does this mean for our neighborhood?" Mrs. Baker asked, her voice calm but with an edge of steel. "Will we be safe?" Detective Martinez nodded firmly. "Blackwood will be moved far from here, and with the information he's providing, we'll be able to shut down a lot of the criminal operations in this area. In the long run, this should make your community safer." Tiana turned back to face them, her initial shock giving way to determination. "Then we need to be ready. If there's going to be a power vacuum in the criminal world, we need to make sure our young people aren't tempted to fill it." Mrs. Baker squeezed Tiana's shoulder approvingly. "Well said, dear. Detective, how can we help?" Over the next hour, the three women discussed strategies for community outreach and youth engagement. They planned workshops, sports programs, and job training initiatives, all aimed at providing positive alternatives for the neighborhood's young people. As Detective Martinez left, promising to return with more resources and support from the police department, Tiana felt a renewed sense of purpose. The news about Lucas had been a setback, but it had also galvanized her resolve. "Mrs. Baker," Tiana said, turning to the older woman, "I think it's time we take our efforts to the next level. We need to reach more people, show them there's a better way." Mrs. Baker's eyes twinkled with excitement. "What did you have in mind, dear?" Tiana outlined her idea: a community festival showcasing local talents, providing information on job opportunities and educational programs, and bringing the neighborhood together in a celebration of its strengths and potential. Mrs. Baker listened, nodding approvingly. "It's ambitious," she said when Tiana finished. "But I think it's exactly what we need. Let's do it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Tiana threw herself into organizing the festival, coordinating with local businesses, schools, and community groups. She reached out to her contacts at the university, securing volunteers and resources. There were challenges, of course. Some local business owners were hesitant to participate, fearing the festival might attract the wrong element. Tiana met with each of them personally, sharing her story and her vision for the community. Slowly but surely, support for the event grew. The day of the festival dawned bright and clear. Tiana arrived at the park early, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement. As she helped set up booths and hang banners, she saw familiar faces arriving, teenagers from her mentoring group, eager to help, Mrs. Baker directing volunteers with cheerful efficiency, even Detective Martinez, off-duty but present to show her support. As the festival got underway, Tiana found herself constantly on the move. She helped man the information booth, answered questions from curious residents, and cheered on the local bands performing on the small stage they'd set up. Mid-afternoon, as she took a moment to catch her breath, Tiana spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was Zoe, the girl who had confided in her weeks earlier. Zoe was with her parents, all three of them smiling as they explored the festival. Zoe caught Tiana's eye and waved enthusiastically. She hurried over, her parents following. "Miss Thompson, this is amazing! I can't believe you put all this together." Tiana smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "I had a lot of help. Are you enjoying the festival?" Zoe nodded eagerly. "It's great. I signed up for that coding workshop you told me about, and Dad's talking to someone about a job training program." Zoe's mother stepped forward, grasping Tiana's hand. "We can't thank you enough for what you've done for our family. You've given Zoe a new direction, a new hope." Tiana felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm just glad I could help. This is what community is all about, supporting each other, lifting each other up." As Zoe and her family moved on to explore more of the festival, Mrs. Baker appeared at Tiana's side. "You've done a wonderful thing here, my dear," she said, surveying the bustling park. "Look at all these people coming together. This is how we build a stronger community." Tiana nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over her. It's amazing what we can do when we work together. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the festival, Tiana took a moment to reflect. She thought about how far she'd come from that night in the abandoned building with Lucas. The fear and uncertainty of that experience had been transformed into strength and purpose. The festival was more than just a day of fun and information. It was a statement, a declaration that this community would not be defined by its struggles or its past. It was a beacon of hope, showing what was possible when people came together with a common goal. As the last of the attendees began to drift away and the cleanup began, Tiana felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She knew there would be more challenges ahead. The work of rebuilding and strengthening a community was never truly finished. But looking around at the smiling faces of her neighbors, the proud expressions of the young people who had helped organize the event, Tiana knew they were on the right path. Mrs. Baker approached, putting an arm around Tiana's shoulders. "Well, my dear, what's next?" Tiana grinned, her mind already buzzing with new ideas. "I was thinking we could start a mentorship program pairing up college students with kids from the neighborhood, and maybe a community garden project." Mrs. Baker chuckled. "One thing at a time, dear. But I like where your head's at. We've made a good start here." As they walked together, discussing plans for the future, Tiana felt a profound sense of belonging. This community, which she had once seen as just a backdrop to her college life, had become her home in the truest sense of the word. The abandoned building that had once represented danger and temptation now stood as a reminder of how far she'd come and the positive change she was capable of creating. The night air was cool and filled with possibility. Tiana breathed it in deeply, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The success of the community festival had energized Tiana and the entire neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, she found herself busier than ever, juggling her studies with her increasing responsibilities at the community center. The mentorship program she had proposed was taking shape, with several of her fellow university students signing up to work with local kids. One crisp autumn afternoon, Tiana was at the community center, reviewing applications for the mentorship program, when Mrs. Baker burst in, her face flushed with excitement. "Tiana dear, you won't believe who I just got off the phone with," Mrs. Baker said, her eyes sparkling. "The mayor's office. They've heard about our work here and want to use our program as a model for other neighborhoods in the city." Tiana's eyes widened in surprise. "That's incredible, Mrs. Baker. But why didn't they contact us directly?" Mrs. Baker waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how these things work. They called the councilman who called me. But that's not important. What matters is that they want to meet with us next week to discuss funding and expansion opportunities." As the reality of this opportunity sank in, Tiana felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was a chance to make an even bigger difference, to spread their message of community empowerment across the city. But it also meant increased scrutiny and pressure. "We'll need to prepare a presentation," Tiana said, her mind already racing. "Statistics on our programs, testimonials from participants, projections for expansion." Mrs. Baker nodded approvingly. "That's my girl. Always thinking ahead. Why don't you take the lead on this? You've been the driving force behind most of our recent initiatives." Tiana agreed, feeling a surge of confidence. This was her chance to prove that her ideas could work on a larger scale. Over the next week, Tiana threw herself into preparation. She gathered data, interviewed program participants, and worked late into the night crafting a compelling presentation. The night before the meeting, she was still at the community center, rehearsing her talking points. As she practiced, she heard a noise from outside. Peering out the window, she saw a group of teenagers hanging around the abandoned building where her adventure with Lucas had begun. Her heart sank as she recognized one of them. It was Kevin, a troubled kid she'd been trying to reach through the mentorship program. Without hesitation, Tiana grabbed her jacket and headed outside. As she approached the group, she could hear them talking excitedly about some business opportunity one of them had heard about. "Hey guys," Tiana called out, keeping her voice casual. "It's a little late to be hanging out here, isn't it?" The teens turned, startled. Kevin's face flushed with guilt when he saw Tiana. "We were just, Tiana raised an eyebrow. "Just what, Kevin? Looking for trouble?" One of the other boys, a lanky kid with a defiant expression, stepped forward. "What's it to you, lady? We ain't doing nothing wrong." Tiana took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I know you're not doing anything wrong right now, but I also know that hanging around abandoned buildings late at night rarely leads to anything good. Trust me, I've been there." She saw a flicker of interest in their eyes. Encouraged, Tiana continued, sharing a condensed version of her experience with Lucas. As she spoke, she could see the teens' attitudes shifting, their bravado fading into uncertainty. "Look," Tiana said, "I know you're looking for excitement, for a way to make money and feel important, but there are better ways to do that, ways that won't put you in danger or get you in trouble with the law." Kevin, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Like what? It's not like we got a lot of options around here." Tiana saw her opening. "Actually, you do. Remember that mentorship program I told you about, Kevin? Well, it's not just about tutoring. We're setting up internships with local businesses, sports programs, even a coding boot camp. Real opportunities to learn skills and make connections." She could see the interest in their eyes, but also the lingering doubt. The lanky boy spoke again, his tone less confrontational now. "That sounds cool and all, but how do we know it's for real? Adults are always making promises they don't keep." Tiana nodded, understanding their skepticism. "Fair point. How about this? Come by the community center tomorrow afternoon. No commitment, just check it out. If you're not impressed, you can walk away. But I think you'll be surprised by what we have to offer." There was a moment of hesitation, then Kevin nodded. "Okay, we'll come, but this better not be a waste of time." Tiana smiled. "It won't be, I promise. As the teens dispersed, heading home for the night, Tiana felt a mix of relief and worry. She'd managed to avert a potential crisis, but she knew this was just the beginning. These kids needed more than just one night of intervention. Returning to the community center, Tiana's mind raced. She'd have to rework her presentation for the mayor's office. This wasn't just about statistics and programs anymore. It was about real kids, facing real challenges, needing real solutions. She worked through the night, fueled by determination and countless cups of coffee. When Mrs. Baker arrived early the next morning, she found Tiana still at it, surrounded by notes and empty coffee cups. "Tiana, have you been here all night?" Mrs. Baker exclaimed, concern evident in her voice. Tiana looked up, bleary-eyed but excited. "Mrs. Baker, I'm glad you're here. We need to make some changes to our presentation." She quickly filled Mrs. Baker in on the previous night's events and her new ideas. As she spoke, Mrs. Baker's expression changed from concern to understanding to enthusiasm. "You're right, dear," Mrs. Baker said when Tiana finished. "This is exactly the kind of real-world impact we need to show. But are you sure you're up for this? You look exhausted." Tiana straightened her shoulders. "I'm fine. This is too important to let a little fatigue get in the way." Mrs. Baker nodded, a proud smile on her face. "All right then, let's get to work." The meeting with the mayor's representatives went better than they could have hoped. Tiana's passion and first-hand accounts of the community's needs resonated strongly. By the end of the presentation, the officials were not just interested, they were enthusiastic. "This is exactly the kind of grassroots initiative we've been looking for," one of the representatives said. "We'd like to start implementing your program in other neighborhoods as soon as possible." As they left City Hall, Mrs. Baker squeezed Tiana's hand. "You did it, my dear. You've opened doors that will help not just our community, but others across the city." Tiana felt a wave of emotion wash over her. "We did it, Mrs. Baker. I couldn't have done any of this without you and the whole community supporting me." But there was no time to rest on their laurels. They rushed back to the community center where Kevin and his friends would be arriving soon. The teens showed up, trying to look nonchalant, but unable to hide their curiosity. Tiana and Mrs. Baker, along with some of the university student mentors, spent the afternoon showing them around, introducing them to program participants, and demonstrating some of the skills they could learn. By the end of the day, all of the teens, even the initially skeptical, lanky boy, had signed up for various programs. Kevin, in particular, seemed transformed, his eyes shining with excitement as he talked about the coding boot camp. As the last of the teens left, promising to return the next day, Tiana finally allowed herself to relax. She slumped into a chair, the exhaustion of the past 24 hours catching up with her. Mrs. Baker sat beside her, patting her hand. "You've done a wonderful thing, Tiana. Those boys were on the brink of making some very bad decisions. You've given them a new path." Tiana nodded, too tired to speak. But despite her exhaustion, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why she did this work. Not for recognition or praise, but for moments like this. Moments where she could see lives changing for the better. As she finally headed home that evening, Tiana paused to look at the abandoned building where her journey had begun. Once a symbol of danger and temptation, it now stood as a reminder of how far she'd come and how much good she could do. The city stretched out before her, a landscape of challenges and opportunities. Tiana knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, disappointments, and moments of doubt. But she also knew she had the strength, the support, and the determination to face whatever came her way. With a small smile, Tiana turned away from the abandoned building and walked towards home, her mind already planning the next day's activities. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was also full of hope. The expansion of the community program brought new challenges and opportunities. As word spread about their success, Tiana found herself increasingly in the public eye. Local news stations wanted interviews, politicians sought photo opportunities, and other community organizations reached out for advice and collaboration. One morning, as Tiana was sorting through a pile of emails and interview requests, Mrs. Baker entered her office with a serious expression. "Tiana, dear, we need to talk," Mrs. Baker said, closing the door behind her. "I've just received some troubling news." Tiana looked up, concern etching her features. "What is it, Mrs. Baker?" "It's about Lucas Blackwood," Mrs. Baker said, her voice low. "He's been released from prison. Apparently, the information he provided was even more valuable than anticipated. He's been placed in a witness protection program." The news hit Tiana like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face as memories of that night in the abandoned building came flooding back. "Released? But how? When?" Tiana stammered, trying to process this information. Mrs. Baker shook her head. "The details are scarce. Detective Martinez called to warn us. She wanted us to be aware just in case." Tiana stood up abruptly, pacing the small office. "This can't be happening. After everything he did, everything he was involved in, he just gets to walk free?" Mrs. Baker approached Tiana, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know it's not fair, dear, but we need to focus on what we can control. Our community, our programs. We can't let this setback derail all the good work we've been doing." Tiana took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Mrs. Baker was right, of course. They couldn't change the decision about Lucas, but they could continue to make a difference in their community. "You're right," Tiana said finally. "But we need to be prepared. If Lucas is out there somewhere, we need to make sure our kids are protected. They need to know how to recognize and avoid people like him." Mrs. Baker nodded approvingly. "That's my girl. Always thinking ahead. What do you have in mind?" Over the next few hours, Tiana and Mrs. Baker worked on developing a new component for their youth programs. They created workshops focused on recognizing manipulation tactics, understanding the dangers of get-rich-quick schemes, and building self-esteem to resist negative influences. As they worked, Tiana felt her initial fear and anger transform into determination. She couldn't change what had happened with Lucas, but she could use her experience to help others avoid similar situations. The next day, Tiana called a meeting with all the mentors and program leaders. She shared the news about Lucas and introduced the new workshop ideas. "I know this is concerning news," Tiana said, addressing the worried faces around her. "But we can't let fear paralyze us. Instead, we're going to use this as an opportunity to strengthen our programs and better protect our community." The team rallied around Tiana's ideas, offering suggestions and volunteering to help develop the new curriculum. Their support and enthusiasm helped ease the knot of anxiety in Tiana's chest. As the meeting concluded, Kevin, the teenager Tiana had steered away from trouble weeks earlier, approached her. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "I heard about that Lucas guy getting out. Are you okay?" Tiana was touched by his concern. "I'm all right, Kevin, but thank you for asking. How are you feeling about it?" Kevin shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "It's messed up, you know, but I've been thinking. Maybe I could help with those new workshops you're planning. I mean, I know what it's like to be tempted by that stuff. Maybe I could talk to the younger kids, help them understand." Tiana felt a surge of pride. This was exactly the kind of peer leadership she had hoped to foster. "That's a great idea, Kevin. I think your perspective would be really valuable. Let's set up a time to discuss how we can make that happen." As Kevin walked away, visibly pleased with the positive response, Tiana felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, Lucas was out there somewhere. But here, in this community, they were building something stronger than any criminal enterprise. Over the next few weeks, Tiana threw herself into implementing the new programs. She coordinated with local schools to bring the workshops to a wider audience, worked with law enforcement to incorporate the latest information on criminal recruitment tactics, and even began developing an app that would provide resources and support for at-risk youth. The work was challenging and often exhausting, but Tiana found it deeply fulfilling. Every time she saw a kid's eyes light up with understanding, every time a parent thanked her for helping their child make better choices, she knew she was making a real difference. One evening, as Tiana was locking up the community center after a particularly successful workshop, she noticed a familiar figure standing across the street. Her heart raced as she recognized Detective Martinez. "Detective!" Tiana called out, crossing the street to meet her. "Is everything all right?" Detective Martinez nodded, a small smile on her face. "Everything's fine, Tiana. I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing with everything." Tiana understood the unspoken reference to Lucas. "It was tough at first," she admitted, "but we've turned it into something positive. Want to come in? I can show you what we've been working on." The detective agreed, and Tiana gave her a tour of the center, explaining their new programs and initiatives. As they talked, Tiana could see the impressed look on Detective Martinez's face. "You've done amazing work here, Tiana," the detective said as they concluded the tour. "I've seen a lot of community programs in my time, but this is special." Tiana felt a warmth spread through her chest at the praise. "Thank you, Detective. That means a lot coming from you." As they stood in the quiet community center, Detective Martinez's expression turned serious. "There's something else you should know, Tiana. We've been monitoring chatter in some of the criminal circles Lucas was involved with. There's been discussion about the work you're doing here." Tiana felt her body tense. What kind of discussion? "Some of these organizations are noticing a drop in recruitment from this area," the detective explained. "They're not happy about it. I don't want to alarm you, but I think you need to be aware. Your work is making a real impact, and not everyone is pleased about that." Tiana absorbed this information, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. "What should we do?" Detective Martinez placed a reassuring hand on Tiana's shoulder. "Keep doing what you're doing. We'll increase patrols in the area. Keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. But don't let this scare you, Tiana. What you're doing here is important. You're changing lives." As the detective left, Tiana stood for a moment in the darkened community center. She thought about how far she'd come from that naive girl who had followed Lucas into an abandoned building. She thought about Kevin and the other kids whose lives had been changed by their programs. Yes, there were still dangers out there. Lucas was free, and there were people who didn't appreciate the positive changes in the community. But Tiana was no longer afraid. She was part of something bigger now, something powerful. She walked to the window and looked out at the neighborhood. The abandoned building where her journey had begun was barely visible in the distance. But here, in this community center, a new story was being written. A story of hope, resilience, and transformation. Tiana smiled to herself as she turned off the lights and locked the door. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready to face them. With her community behind her and the strength she'd discovered within herself, she knew that together they could overcome anything. The weeks following Detective Martinez's warning were tense but productive. Tiana and her team doubled down on their efforts, expanding their programs and reaching out to even more at-risk youth. The community rallied around them, with local businesses offering internships and parents volunteering their time and skills. One afternoon, as Tiana was leading a workshop on financial literacy for teenagers, she noticed an unfamiliar face at the back of the room. The man was dressed casually, but something about his posture and the way his eyes scanned the room set off alarm bells in Tiana's mind. As the workshop ended and the teens filed out, Tiana approached the stranger. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping her voice friendly but firm. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Thompson, I presume. I'm John Reeves from the Oakdale Investment Group. I was hoping we could have a chat about some potential funding opportunities for your programs." Tiana's instincts were screaming that something wasn't right, but she maintained her composure. "I'm always happy to discuss support for our community initiatives, Mr. Reeves. Why don't we set up a proper meeting? You can contact our administrative office to schedule something." Reeves's smile faltered slightly. "I was hoping we could speak more privately. Perhaps over dinner. I have a proposition that I think you'll find very interesting." Now Tiana was certain this was not a legitimate offer. She straightened her shoulders, meeting Reeves's gaze directly. "Mr. Reeves, all discussions about our programs and funding are conducted through official channels with our full team present. If you're genuinely interested in supporting our work, you'll respect that process. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another session to prepare for." As Tiana turned to leave, Reeves called out, "You're making a mistake, Ms. Thompson. There are powerful people who aren't happy with what you're doing here. It would be in your best interest to hear us out." Tiana paused, then turned back to face him. "Is that a threat, Mr. Reeves?" Reeves shrugged, his facade of friendliness completely gone. "Let's call it a friendly warning. Think about it, Ms. Thompson. We'll be in touch." As Reeves left, Tiana's mind was racing. She immediately called Mrs. Baker and Detective Martinez, relaying the encounter in detail. "You did the right thing, Tiana," Detective Martinez assured her over the phone. "We'll look into this Oakdale investment group. In the meantime, be extra cautious. Don't go anywhere alone, and report any suspicious activity immediately." Mrs. Baker arrived at the community center within the hour, her face etched with concern. "Oh, my dear," she said, pulling Tiana into a hug. "Are you all right?" Tiana nodded, feeling stronger with Mrs. Baker's support. "I'm fine, just shaken up a bit. But we can't let this stop us, Mrs. Baker. If anything, it proves that what we're doing is making a real difference." Mrs. Baker's expression hardened with determination. "You're absolutely right. If these criminals are feeling threatened by our work, then we must be doing something right. But we need to be smart about this, Tiana. We can't put our young people at risk." Over the next few days, Tiana and Mrs. Baker worked with Detective Martinez to implement new security measures at the community center. They installed security cameras, implemented a sign-in system for visitors, and held safety briefings for all staff and volunteers. Despite the underlying tension, Tiana refused to let fear dictate their actions. The programs continued, and if anything, the community's resolve seemed to strengthen in the face of this veiled threat. A week after Reeves's visit, Tiana was working late at the center when she received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it took her a moment to place it. "Tiana, it's Lucas." Tiana felt her blood run cold. "Lucas, how did you get this number? Why are you calling me?" Lucas's voice sounded strained, almost desperate. "Listen, I don't have much time. I know you have no reason to trust me, but you're in danger. The people I used to work for, they're not happy about what you're doing. That man who came to see you, Reeves, he's just the beginning." Tiana's mind was reeling. "Why are you telling me this? Why should I believe you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Because despite everything, I'm not a monster, Tiana. What I did to you was wrong, and I can't change that. But I can try to make sure you don't pay for my mistakes. These people, they're dangerous, more dangerous than you can imagine." Before Tiana could respond, Lucas continued urgently. "I have to go. Just be careful. And Tiana, I'm sorry. For everything." The line went dead, leaving Tiana staring at her phone in shock. She immediately called Detective Martinez, relaying the conversation. The detective's voice was grim. "This complicates things. If Lucas is breaking his witness protection agreement to warn you, the threat must be serious. We'll need to take additional precautions." Over the next few days, plainclothes officers were stationed near the community center, and Tiana found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. But she refused to be intimidated. If anything, this pressure only strengthened her resolve. In a meeting with her team, Tiana addressed the situation head-on. "I know everyone's worried," she began, looking around at the concerned faces. "And I won't lie to you. There are people out there who don't like what we're doing. But that's because we're making a real difference. We're changing lives, and that threatens their operations." She paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. "I can't ask any of you to put yourselves in danger. If anyone wants to step back, I completely understand. But I'm not going anywhere. These kids, this community, they're worth fighting for." To Tiana's amazement and pride, not a single person left. Instead, they began discussing ways to further secure their programs and protect their participants. Kevin, who had become one of their most dedicated peer mentors, spoke up. "Ms. Thompson, maybe we could start a neighborhood watch program, get the whole community involved in keeping an eye out for suspicious activity." Tiana smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "That's an excellent idea, Kevin. Let's work on that." As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Baker pulled Tiana aside. "I'm so proud of you, my dear. You've shown true leadership today, but please promise me you'll be careful. We can't do this work without you." Tiana squeezed Mrs. Baker's hand reassuringly. "I promise. We're in this together, remember?" Over the next few weeks, the community rallied around the center like never before. The Neighborhood Watch program took off, with residents patrolling the streets and reporting any suspicious activity. Local businesses increased their support, offering more internships and job opportunities to program participants. The pressure from the criminal elements didn't disappear, but it became clear that they were facing a united front. Tiana received reports of would-be recruiters being turned away by groups of watchful residents, and enrollment in their programs continued to grow. One evening, as Tiana was leaving the community center, she paused to look at the abandoned building where her journey had begun. It stood as a stark reminder of how far she'd come and how much had changed. She thought about Lucas, about the choices he'd made and the warning he'd given her. She thought about Reeves and the threats he represented. But mostly she thought about Kevin and all the other young people whose lives were being transformed. In that moment, Tiana realized that she was no longer afraid. She was part of something bigger than herself, something powerful and important. The road ahead might be difficult, but she wasn't walking it alone. With a small smile, Tiana turned away from the abandoned building and walked towards home, her head held high. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them, because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a community coming together to create real, lasting change. And that, Tiana knew, was worth any risk. The community's united front seemed to be making a difference. Weeks passed without any overt threats or suspicious activities. Tiana and her team continued their work, expanding their programs and reaching even more young people. The success stories were piling up. Kids staying in school, finding jobs, and turning away from the lure of easy money and criminal activities. One crisp autumn morning, Tiana arrived at the community center to find Detective Martinez waiting for her. The detective's expression was grave, and Tiana felt a knot form in her stomach. "What's happened?" Tiana asked, unlocking the center's door and ushering the detective inside. Detective Martinez waited until they were in Tiana's office before speaking. "We've uncovered some disturbing information. The Oakdale Investment Group that approached you? It's a front for a much larger criminal organization. We believe they're trying to establish a foothold in this area, and your work is a major obstacle for them." Tiana sank into her chair, processing this information. "So what do we do?" The detective leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "We're building a case against them, but it's complex. These people are smart, well-connected. We need hard evidence to bring them down." A thought struck Tiana. "Lucas, could his information help?" Detective Martinez nodded slowly. "Potentially, but he's in witness protection. Bringing him into this could put him at risk." Tiana felt conflicted. Lucas had caused her so much pain, had been part of the very criminal world they were fighting against. But he had also warned her, potentially putting himself in danger to do so. Before she could respond, there was a commotion outside. They rushed out to find Mrs. Baker arguing with a man Tiana recognized as John Reeves, the supposed investment group representative who had threatened her weeks ago. "You have no right to be here," Mrs. Baker was saying, her voice firm despite the fear evident in her eyes. "I'm calling the police." Reeves smiled coldly. No need for that. I'm just here to have a friendly chat with Ms. Thompson. Isn't that right, Tiana? Detective Martinez stepped forward, her badge out. John Reeves, I'm Detective Martinez. I think you'd better come with me. We have some questions about Oakdale Investment Group. Reeves's smile faltered for a moment before returning, even colder than before. Of course, Detective. I'm always happy to cooperate with law enforcement. But this isn't over, Ms. Thompson. You're playing a dangerous game. As Detective Martinez led Reeves away, Tiana turned to Mrs. Baker. Are you okay? Mrs. Baker nodded, though she looked shaken. I'm fine, dear, but I'm worried about you. These people won't stop, will they? Tiana shook her head grimly. No, I don't think they will, but neither will we. Over the next few days, Tiana worked closely with Detective Martinez, providing any information that might help build the case against the criminal organization behind Oakdale Investment Group. She also doubled down on security measures at the center, ensuring that all staff and participants were trained in safety protocols. Despite the looming threat, Tiana refused to let fear dictate their actions. The programs continued, and the community's support only grew stronger in the face of adversity. One evening, as Tiana was locking up the center, she received an unexpected visitor. Lucas stood in the shadows, looking nervous and out of place. Lucas, what are you doing here? It's not safe for you to be seen, Tiana said, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Lucas stepped forward, his face haggard. I know, but I couldn't stay away. Tiana, I have information that could help bring down the organization behind Oakdale, but if I come forward, I'll be putting myself at risk. Tiana studied him, seeing the conflict in his eyes. Why would you do that? Why risk everything? Lucas looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. Because it's the right thing to do. Because I've done so much wrong and maybe this is my chance to do something good. And because I owe you, Tiana. What I did to you trying to drag you into that world, I can never make up for that. But maybe I can help protect you and the good work you're doing here. Tiana felt a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at what Lucas had done, gratitude for his warning, and now, a grudging respect for his willingness to make amends. Lucas, I can't ask you to put yourself in danger. Lucas shook his head. You're not asking. I'm offering. This is my choice. After a moment's hesitation, Tiana nodded. Okay. Let me call Detective Martinez. We'll figure out how to do this safely. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Lucas worked with the police, providing crucial information that helped them build a solid case against the criminal organization. Tiana continued her work at the community center, all while under increased police protection. Finally, the day came when Detective Martinez arrived at the center with news. We did it, she announced to Tiana and Mrs. Baker. Based on Lucas's information and the evidence we've gathered, we've made multiple arrests. The top leaders of the organization are in custody. Tiana felt a wave of relief wash over her. So it's over? Detective Martinez smiled, though her eyes remained serious. This particular threat is neutralized, but our work isn't done. There will always be those who prey on vulnerable communities. What you're doing here, providing opportunities, building strength and resilience, that's the long-term solution. As the detective left, Mrs. Baker turned to Tiana with tears in her eyes. Oh, my dear, you've been so brave through all of this. I couldn't be prouder if you were my own granddaughter. Tiana hugged Mrs. Baker tightly, feeling the emotion of the moment. I couldn't have done any of this without you, without this whole community. In the days that followed, life at the community center slowly returned to normal, or rather, a new normal. The sense of unity and purpose that had developed during the crisis remained, strengthening their programs and outreach efforts. Lucas, his role in bringing down the criminal organization kept confidential, was relocated for his safety. Before he left, he met with Tiana one last time. I know I can never undo what I did, he said, his eyes filled with regret. But I want you to know that seeing the work you're doing here, how you've turned your experience into something positive, it's inspired me to try and do better." Tiana nodded, feeling a sense of closure. "Thank you, Lucas, for your help and for taking responsibility for your actions. I hope you find a way to make a positive difference wherever you go." As Lucas left, Tiana turned to face the community center. Through the windows, she could see kids arriving for after-school programs, volunteers setting up for classes, and Mrs. Baker greeting everyone with her warm smile. The abandoned building that had once been a symbol of danger and temptation now stood as a reminder of how far they'd come. Tiana smiled to herself, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. From a naive college student lured by the promise of excitement, she had become a community leader, making a real difference in people's lives. She knew that there would always be challenges ahead. There would be other criminals, other threats to the community's well-being. But she also knew that they were stronger now, more united and resilient than ever before. As Tiana walked into the community center, ready to start another day of changing lives, she felt a profound sense of purpose. This was where she belonged, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who shared her vision for a better future. The story that had begun in fear and uncertainty in an abandoned building had transformed into one of hope, courage, and community. And Tiana knew that this was just the beginning. There were more stories to be written, more lives to be changed, and a whole community ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together.